Everybody. I am so excited to be having this conversation with Dr. Lee Frame on ultra-processed foods and really getting into some of the nitty-gritty in terms of why we've both gotten really excited about some of the media coverage on this topic. But first, my name is Laura Zachary. I'm an integrative pharmacist and a nutritionist, and I am really focused on lifestyle medicine and how we can use food as medicine specifically. So you can see why this is such an exciting topic for us, and I will let Dr. Frame introduce herself.
Hi, Lee Frame. I am the Director of Integrative Medicine at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, among many other things. But we call by GW for short, so I will refer to GW as GW from now on. My background, I have a PhD in nutrition and a master's in immunology, and so I really like to put those two things together. And so a lot of my work is about obesity, vitamin D, and the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome is really the one that gets me excited about the ultra processed foods.
Okay, so some things that we definitely want to make sure that we highlight as we have this conversation. First, defining ultra processed foods and talking about why that's different and that nuance is important between processed and ultra processed food. And then we'll get into how that interaction happens on the microbiome level and how this is going to really shift in terms of the way that we make recommendations clinically, and why, again, we're so excited about this added nuance in nutrition. So first of all, Lee, this conversation evolved out of the fact that you were recently interviewed to talk about ultra processed foods. I forget which publication it
The
was.
Guardian.
The Guardian. So could you tell us a little bit about that article and a little bit about the snippet and what you contributed?
Yeah, so this, first of all, I love The Guardian, so I was super excited to get interviewed by The Guardian. And this was actually in response to a movie that's come out on Netflix called Flaming Hot Cheetos. And it's about the story of how these were produced. And it's not necessarily about ultra processed foods in general, but it really touches on the fact that these foods are produced very differently than other foods, and how they come to be is very different than other foods. And so The Guardian decided they wanted to do an article about why ultra processed foods are different and what are the potential health effects from those foods. So I was very excited to be able to talk about it. And the main quote that I was quoted on was actually something that I use all the time, was about how the way we consume ultra processed foods is so different as well. The quote was basically, have you ever eaten a dozen ears of corn? Well, probably not, right? Most people can't eat that much corn. But a whole bag of Doritos, no problem. And it's almost the same amount of corn. So there's something clearly different about how our body perceives that amount of food once it's been processed from corn on the cob or even corn off the cob to this flour and then turned into a Dorito. Despite the fact that I think that Doritos are delicious, it's not something that I try to eat because it's so easy to accidentally overconsume and thus have extra calories that your body really doesn't need.
And that's such a great visual because that really stood out for me. And it reminds me of the phrase "you can't eat just one," right? Like that was
Yes.
like the potato chips. I forget what brand it was, and that's literally exactly the point. Those are potato chips, so replace corn with potatoes. But similarly, you're not going to sit down and eat like a dozen potatoes, yet you can eat an entire bag of potato chips or fries for that matter, right? So I think there's something to be said, not only about the process of sort of churning it down and making it very easy to consume because it's so compact, but it also, from a palatability perspective, also changes the way we perceive that food. And then you take that a step further, where a lot of the flavorings and the way that we then make that food either even more delicious, right? It
Hmm.
is created so that it appeals to our brain, and we, again, you can't stop and eat just one. So not only is it easier to fit inside your stomach, but it's also, you're craving it, you want more of it, and it's literally creating a reaction in your brain that makes it very hard to stop consuming at a certain point. which is forget the calorie thing. I talk about that all the time. It's not necessarily about the calories. It's not even always about the quality of the calories, right? Like that's arguably it's what else is like what is that a carrier for? And if you're eating a lot of these foods, that probably means there's not a lot of room left to eat a lot of the other foods that can have a
Right.
potential beneficial effect, right?
Right, exactly. They're displacing healthy foods because that's what you want to eat, right? Like you eat it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Your brain is going crazy. And so, of course, your body wants you to eat those things when you have that response. In fact, that's actually how your body gets you to eat, period, right? Like we need to have this response so that we eat and take care of ourselves and reproduce and all the things that we're supposed to be doing. But this is taking this completely out of whack and it's something your body had never seen before, right? Like it's kind of hacking the mechanism that's there for healthy food and thus it's getting off the rails.
Absolutely. And it makes it so that eating a salad is not going to be as exciting, right? Like it just relatively it's like going skydiving and then like going down a slide. Like it's just not the same feeling.
Correct.
Right? So okay, this all probably makes sense for a lot of people who are watching or listening to this and going, okay, where's the exciting part? Like I think we all knew that these foods were not healthy for us. What's so exciting about the ultra processed piece and the relative kind of surge in media that we're getting around this?
Well, for one, food processing is not inherently a problem. Processing means pretty much anything we do to food, right? Cutting it, putting it in a can, preserving it in any sort of way, braising, roasting, all of those things are food processing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with those. The reason ultra processed is so important is because that's a type of processing that you can't do in your kitchen. It's really food chemistry. It is food science in the most extreme version of the word. And what happens is in that ultra processing process, the food is actually removed from its matrix. So it's no longer a food in the sense that your body understands it to be food. And so, thus, your body doesn't process it and recognize it in the same way. And that's why you can eat a whole bag of Doritos, but you couldn't eat 12 ears of corn because the food matrix is still present in that corn. That includes things like fiber, all the different nutrients that come with it. And just it seems like that's the structure and what's there and how they come together. The body has seen them before. It knows what it is. Whereas when it sees these other foods, these ultra processed foods, it doesn't fully recognize it. And you don't have the same satiety that you would get from eating similar food of that was not ultra processed.
I think that's such an important point. I'm going to extrapolate that a little bit too, because you said something about the body's recognition of that food. We're seeing the surge in food sensitivities, food reactivities, food allergies. And to a certain extent, there is theoretically part of that is the increased consumption or the fact that the body is not recognizing some of these foods in some of these forms and building a reactivity to it. So I see in my practice folks, so for example, that are ultra sensitive to corn, and one of the theories is that because corn is used as a base in a lot of our ultra processed foods, that protein is manipulated to an extent where the body no longer recognizes it and becomes a trigger down the line, either for autoimmunity or allergic disease, or even just a sensitivity where the body just doesn't like it. It's not a full out immune response, but it's sort of reactive in some way. And it's kind of the basis as to why we see some of the elimination diets being useful and why we see some people do well on things like autoimmune protocols and paleo diets and those kinds of things. And this is
Mm,
starting to get a little bit like off the topic, but you start to see where in an environment where there's a lot of ultra processed foods, you start to get dangerously close to eliminating other foods in a response. And what we're trying to do is avoid that. We want people to be able to eat as much food variety as possible,
mm.
but because of this sort of shift in environment, at least again, this is not the only reason. I want to make that clear. We're seeing sort of this potential trigger, this potential shift in some people's immune response. Any thoughts on that?
Lots of thoughts. So the first thing being that if you look at a lot of these diets that have become popular lately, paleo, even carnivore, vegan, all of these diets, they have a lot of things in common, and most of are basically getting rid of ultra processed foods.
Yeah.
And so no matter what you're eating, if you get rid of ultra processed foods, you're going to have a benefit. And so I think that is really saying something, that all of these diets have that in common. But the other thing is, when you are eating an ultra processed foods, not only have they been altered, but even the elements of them have not been altered. Let's say, for instance, gluten, if we're talking
Mhm.
about wheat, that's a hot topic, right?
Mhm.
Um, they're often there in much larger doses. And the dose is actually really, really important when it comes to nutrition and when it comes to the immune system, right? Small amounts are kind of like, oh, that's just there. It's homeostatic. We're fine. But when we get really large doses that you're consuming from having these often large amounts of ultra processed foods, because it's hard to stop yourself, then you can have the body overreact, right? It's saying, oh gosh, why is there so much of this here? Maybe it's an invasion, maybe something is wrong. And if we even just reduce the dose of these foods, we may actually see a benefit just from that. So while I think ideally we want to eliminate ultra processed foods from our diet to be the healthiest version we can, that's probably not a realistic thing to do. So just thinking about reducing the amount of them or the serving size that you have can also be really beneficial.
Such a great point, and again, just brings into context where this is coming from, right? And again, to the point that you made earlier, it's not about the processing, right? It's not about necessarily turning a grain, soaking the grain, maybe even turning it to a pasta from that grain. It's the ultra processing, the extra step that's added on top of that, that makes it altered to the extent where the body's no longer recognizing it. Can you speak a little bit more to that interplay? You know, this is the part I left out in talking about the immune response, but the interplay with the microbiome and how we're seeing that shift the conversation as well.
Yeah, so this is a very complex topic, and there's lots of different ways to attack it. And when I think about the microbiome and ultra processed foods, one of the things I think about is, where is this food being digested, right? So if something is very ultra easily digestible, like even for instance, let's say a bone broth, often it doesn't actually even make it to the gut microbiome, right? Like you absorb all of it very quickly and there's nothing left. So that can actually be the one issue, is that some of this food is no longer getting to the microbiome. They're kind of starving. They aren't getting the fibers and the things that they need to eat, because that these foods don't provide them. And then, like you're saying, you're not getting as much of the healthier foods because you're eating these foods. So that's sort of one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, these foods often contain elements that do not come with what we would consider to be whole foods, right? So, like an apple, for instance, versus, I don't know, an apple puff. The ingredients in those two things are going to be very different. One has one ingredient, it's apples, and the other probably has 10 or 15 ingredients, many of which are gums, thickeners, stabilizers, preservatives. Which have not been well studied, to be honest. We don't know a lot about them. Some of them have been in the food system for a long time, and we just kind of assumed everything was fine, but we didn't know about the microbiome. And now that we know about the gut microbiome, we're starting to see that some of these foods, particularly in larger doses, are altering the composition and perhaps also the function of the microbiome, which can make it easier for you to get things like an autoimmune disease. It can just make you generally more inflamed, which is not great. That's how we get chronic diseases, are from chronic inflammation. Or it can cause digestive upset, right? So
Right.
we have people who have gas, bloating, all sorts of constipation, diarrhea, and it could be potentially triggered from these large doses of these compounds, or perhaps even the fact that all of those compounds are coming in there together. Maybe they're magnifying each other's effect.
Yeah.
We don't fully understand, but it's definitely clear that there is something different about these compounds than what we would get from something you're growing in your garden.
Yeah, as you're talking, I was sitting here thinking about how often folks will tell me that certain foods elicit a specific response. I think, for example, there's like jokes around certain fast food restaurants that will give them certain like changes
Yes.
in their bowel movements, right? Things like that. And it's almost like a meme. Like it's so common that it's well kind of understood. And I think I'm thinking about it and thinking about how the processing of those foods as it is, they tend to be very high volume, right? So you're eating a whole lot. A lot of it is very dense as well, high protein, high fat. And so that also has its own kind of response in the GI. And then you add to it a lot of the chemicals that are used in order to give it its unique flavor. That's why a burger from one place tastes different than from a burger from a different fast food place, or a taco from one place tastes different than a different taco from a fast food place. And those are some of the things that are driving not only the shift in the immune response as a result because of this kind of unrecognized content, but also the microbiome, both from like external factors, other reasons that the microbiome is shifting in general and in our population, plus the shifts are happening due to the quality and the content of the diet itself. And so you could start to see, like, I want to zoom it out, and I want to start from like a larger public health picture and kind of zoom into a more clinical, application picture of what that means, because it's very different when we talk about this in terms of public health application versus, okay, what do I do when I'm in a room with a patient application? And each has its challenges in different ways. So let's start with the bigger picture. Now that we're starting to see the shifts, and some countries have actually changed their dietary recommendations and their dietary guidelines based on what has been observed over the last several years, or some larger studies that came out sort of really defining ultra processed foods to the point you made earlier, as well as starting to talk about the health outcomes as a result. And that has shifted several countries to change their guidelines and their recommendations. I'm not sure what that looks like in the US yet. But any thoughts or any ideas about what you see as a good next step when it comes to public health or generalized recommendations?
Yeah, so in the US, our public health recommendations historically have really focused on individual nutrients. Like you need so many milligrams of this vitamin, which, coming from where we came from in the science, like we thought we saw a deficiency, we replaced the vitamin, we fixed the deficiency.
Mhm.
That actually does make a lot of sense. So, like the reason we are where we are, it's perfectly logical. But there's a lot of things we didn't know.
Yeah.
And we didn't realize that, giving a supplement of fiber with an ultra processed food is not the same as having the food that actually had the fiber in it originally.
I'm going to pause you there and ask you to back up, because not everybody watching this is a nutrition professional. And what you said there, I think, is really important because it speaks to the way the evolution of the recommendations. And you have like some great examples for that. Can you just flush out what you mean by that? You said specifically a nutrient to replace a deficiency. And can you just talk a little bit about how it applies to ultra processed food?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the classic example, and it's one they still teach in med school, even though you never see it anymore, is scurvy and vitamin C, right? We all like the pirates are called limeys because they were given limes because the limes presented the gingivitis and the scurvy.
Yeah.
Um, and that is how we discovered nutrients because we saw they were lacking. We figured out if we replaced them. We didn't start with nutrients. We started with foods, right? We were
Right.
like, okay, limes are fixing this.
Right.
And eventually we started to try and figure out, well, what is it in limes that's doing it?
Mhm.
And then we figured, okay, it's vitamin C. And then we realized that if you give a vitamin C supplement, you can prevent scurvy, you can prevent this disease. But the problem is that food is about more than just disease prevention. It's about health promotion.
Yes.
And to figure out how much of a nutrient you need for health promotion is actually much, much more difficult. And that's what we're struggling with right now in the nutrition world is what is optimal? How do you define optimal?
Mhm.
And then how do you translate that into a recommendation is a whole other problem because you aren't going to just talk about getting enough vitamin C because now we understand that food quality and food matrix is important. Another example is when you have different nutrients in a food, they're going to be absorbed differently, right? So
Mhm.
when nutrients are together, they are often absorbed better than when they're separately. So just taking a vitamin, let's talk about iron. Just taking an iron supplement, you're only going to absorb so much. But if you have iron in a food that also contains vitamin C, you're going to absorb a lot more of it. So it's not this like simple math of 1 + 1 = 2 in the nutrition world. Whereas the guidelines were actually developed in a time where we thought it was that simple, like 1 + 1 = 2. And so thus you just need four of these and you're fine.
Right.
but that's not really the case. And so we're already starting to see our guidelines get away from that
Yeah.
and focusing more on dietary patterns.
Hmm.
Having either a Mediterranean diet or something like a Mediterranean diet or a vegan diet or whatever you want to call it, but basically get a lot of whole foods in your diet, get a variety, diversity of different colors of plants, and that usually will end up washing out as long as you aren't including a lot of these ultra processed foods to displace the healthy foods.
And I think that's so important. You do such a good job of explaining that and the food matrix and where those dietary patterns become really relevant and important. And I think to go back to your point about, well, we figured out you need more fiber to help support the microbiome. So what did we start doing is supplementing fiber in an ultra processed form.
Hmm.
And that now becomes not only our very often, especially the foods that purport to contain that fiber tend to be very low amounts of fiber. They're not very
And they contain
significant.
all sorts of other things you don't really want to have, like
Exact
they're
so
high
it
in sugar and yeah.
negates the whole thing, right? So it becomes almost a net negative at the on the other side of it that may have actually contributed to even worsening of microbiome diversity and quantity. So I think that's a really important concept to understand as we start thinking about, okay, now that we know this about ultra processed foods, how do we bridge the gap between that knowledge and the way that we've created food access systems that make it really hard not to rely on ultra processing and on packaged foods, and how do we start to now shift now we're starting to talk about like how systems have to change and how policies need to change in order to start bridging that gap.
Absolutely. And I think similar to our recommendations, we have the food system that we wanted. We wanted people to get enough calories and get enough of these nutrients to not develop things like scurvy. And it
Yes,
does that. Like we
it
don't
does
see
that
scurvy,
brilliantly. Yes.
right? It's these things don't really exist. People are getting the bare minimum and they are getting enough calories.
Yeah.
But that is not really the goal. Like we did not understand what the goal should be. And so now we have this food system that was developed for an incorrect goal. And then we have to fix that food system to actually facilitate the correct goal, which is not simple, particularly because the incentives right now are not there, right? Y- You can't patent an apple, right? Like there are a lot of the things that allow medicine to move forward are just not
Yeah.
available in the nutrition realm.
Yeah.
And if anything, we're getting away from that, right? Like we want to get away from patented products and processing and all that because we want to go back to these whole food matrices. And so there's been some discussion, and I would generally support this of looking at the food bill and saying, we are incentivizing things now that mostly either get turned into ultra processed food for cattle or get turned into ultra processed food for us, or high fructose corn syrup, which goes in ultra processed food.
Right.
And so rather than subsidizing those things, we should be subsidizing foods that are not going to be turned into ultra processed foods. But I do understand that it's not even that simple. There's a lot more to it that maybe would be a nice first step. To help making it a little bit easier. But that doesn't mean we're going to stop having Twinkies or any of those sort of products, which again, I honestly I have never eaten a Twinkie, but I'm not saying that you should never eat a Twinkie. Like
Yeah.
I think that's extreme,
Right.
but it's not something you should be having on a regular basis.
I think the problem lies when that becomes people's option to feel full, right? Like in
Yeah,
order to feel sustained and to feel full, they rely on these ultra processed foods, Twinkies or whatever, right? In order to feel somewhat satiated. Otherwise, if we remove those from their options, it then they become calorie deficient and malnourished. And
correct.
that's the problem,
And
right?
that's a
And
really important point that I think a lot of people are not thinking about.
yeah,
But there are leaders out there in our field who are thinking about that. And we can't just be anti ultra processed food writ large because exactly what you're saying. There are some people who only really have access to those, or it makes up a large percentage of what their food access. Like, for instance, people who get most of their food from corner stores.
yes,
While there are canned products, which I would not consider to be in the ultra processed for most cases,
yes.
like canned corn, canned green beans, those are all fine.
Mhm.
They're probably still the minority of what is available there. And so if
And they're
we
still
removed
overpriced.
and they're overpriced. Exactly. So we need to really fix the food system.
Yeah,
And then there are also people who are talking about maybe there's a healthier way to make ultra processed foods. Maybe we make them, we walk the processing back a little bit or change the processing so that it no longer pushes it to the level that your body doesn't recognize them. And that's
absolutely.
probably possible, but
And
we
that's
don't
probably
know.
possible. And I think that when you open yourself up to the idea that it's possible, then you then have at least a moderate solution to a really large problem. I think one of the other issues and the challenges in the US versus other countries is we're a very large country. So to
Yeah.
fix a food system not only takes, yes, there's a financial piece that you touched on, there's regulations that have to change, but also geographically, we have to get food to a lot of smaller areas and communities. And I think that's also another thing we have to wrap our head around, right? We
Hmm.
can't, and there are some programs, there are some like public health professionals that are trying to come up with programs that can start to bridge that gap to bring in fresh produce into communities that lack access. There are farms and co-ops and stuff that are trying to bridge this need, but not every part of the US, again, because it's so large and diverse, has the ability to grow its own food necessarily. So there's a lot of challenges in this space, and I think it's important to lay out all the possibilities, both the potential for doing better as well as some of the things that we have to start, building towards improving. So now, how do we take that and how do we start thinking about on an individual basis for clinicians that are interested in having these conversations with their patients? How do we translate that to something that is somewhat deliverable? I know it's a big question, right? Because it's going to depend on a lot of variables. But do you have any suggestions or thoughts, particularly what you see clinicians kind of struggling with at this point as they're starting to learn more about nutrition and ultra processed foods?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I see a lot of people struggling with is trying to make everything black and white. Because that's a very clear message, right? It's easy to communicate, don't ever eat ultra processed foods, they're all evil. Um, but that's not actually true, and it can be very off-putting. And so
Yeah.
my response to that is let's try and meet people where they are.
Right.
If someone is eating pretty much exclusively ultra processed foods, we can't tell them to stop eating ultra processed foods. We might need to say, okay, let's start introducing these foods into your diet. Like focus on adding rather
Yeah.
than taking away,
Mhm.
and having those healthy foods start displacing those ultra processed foods naturally. And just slow baby steps like that will actually be much easier to implement. Again, the message might be a little bit more difficult there, but if you're focusing on, okay, we're going to try and add, let's say you have a community garden. Maybe you can grow some squash that you might like to quickly saute, and that could be one thing we're going to add, and we're going to work on that for a summer. And
Right.
then maybe you try and add a few other things. Okay, there's at your corner store, they actually have a salad that
Mhm.
you could add, maybe get one of those with your takeout for your family. So we're kind of adding in things
Mhm.
rather than focusing on subtracting. And then the other thing that I really think is important is to not make anything forbidden, because
Yeah.
when you make something forbidden, then it becomes the forbidden fruit, and we want it really badly, right? So
Yeah.
you don't say you never eat those things, they're off limits, they're bad, because then every time they go in that store, they're going to stare at it and be like, I want that really badly. And what happens is they'll deny themselves for a while, but the
Mhm.
body will take over and the body will say, no, 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 we're going to have that. And then when they finally have it, they're going to eat just way too much of it. It's actually going to end up being worse than if
I
you
mean, and
hadn't denied
remember,
it.
these foods are made to make you crave them, right? And it's
Exactly.
it's not going to be this automatic switch where you intellectually understand it's not good for you. There's an emotional component, there's a neurological component, there's a
Yes.
chemical component, right? Like there's a lot of pieces to consider. So I think that's a really, really great point.
Yeah, and you can't simply willpower your way out of this. And I think that's a very common misconception. Even in the medical community, there are still people out there that think that people who are overweight or who eat things like ultra processed foods just simply don't have the willpower.
Yeah.
And that is a failure of our medical system to educate people on the physiology behind this, because it's
Yes.
so much more complex than that.
Yes.
And if we've relied on willpower for everything, nobody would be able to do anything, frankly. We all have a very small amount of willpower to go around, right? Like
Yes.
getting up in the morning and going to work takes a lot of willpower.
That's 90% of most of our willpower.
Right, right, exactly. So there's not a lot left over for everything else. And particularly when you're busy and you have a family and just life, all of that stuff. If we can make things simple, and I've always said this, if we can make the healthy choice choice, the simple choice, the easy choice, that is really the solution. But
Right.
there's a lot of things that go into that.
And I think a little empathy from that perspective is really important for us to understand as we're talking to individuals about the choices that they have, because they very often don't have the simple choice is not often the healthy choice
Right.
within their structure, their built environment, right? Whether that's because geographically it's not accessible, or because financially it's not acceptable, or time wise it's not available. I think you said, you nailed it. Meet them where they're at. There are solutions for almost every situation outside of the structural issues that we have in terms of food access, right? And that's something that you probably have to escalate and work within the community to address. But from an individual perspective, I think it's really important to keep in mind that for what might work for one individual may not be the solution for another. I think also once we open up our minds to the differences between ultra processed foods, and we say not all ultra processed foods are bad, it starts to change the conversation a little bit. And we start to say, okay, well, that means that canned foods and frozen foods are also very acceptable alternatives. They also mean that they're going to stay longer, and we're going to have less food waste as a result, because if they have a busy week and they resort to processed foods those weeks, then they have a backup in the freezer or in the pantry.
Right.
That's really important. There are also food services and food programs and delivery services and things like that that are also growing. There's one of my favorite is there are a couple of companies. Misfit Market comes to mind, that,
Mhm.
for example, like they take all the foods that are grown that aren't bought by grocery stores and
Because
resell.
they have a birthmark or something on them, or the carrots aren't
They're
completely straight.
shaped
Yeah.
weird, right? But
Silly
they're
things.
perfectly silly things, and they're so reasonably priced, right? And you could buy them in bulk, which is perfect for feeding a family as well. So there are great solutions out
And you're
there,
saving those foods from going to the landfill,
and
so
you're
that's kind of a win-win.
it's such a big win, saving money, getting more produce in the house, and reducing food waste all around. It's a huge win. So there are some great solutions, and I'm curious if folks who are listening to this also have some other solutions or things that have worked with them in their communities. But I think the takeaway message, as you said before, Lee, is to meet them where they're at and to try to find a solution that's acceptable for them. And I think nothing can be off the table until there is equality of access to everybody across the country, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's often a bias that, oh, everyone should just go to Whole Foods and eat a bunch of greens. And it's like, well, that's not realistic. And
Absolutely.
also perhaps, even if it was an option, maybe someone still wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to put your values on someone, and you really need to help them figure out what's going to work best for them and help fulfill their purpose, right?
Yeah.
What is going to give them meaning in life? If they want to be around to help their grandkids, then maybe that's something they can get excited about, but they're still not going to want to go to Whole Foods and eat a bunch of greens.
Humans are motivated by emotional, like they make decisions based on emotional reasons, right? And so I think, to your point again, like what is the reason that they want to make the change? And I think very often we put a moral stance on their decision. And I see this conversation a lot in the conversation around obesity, and the sort of shift, the shift in the country in terms of people's weights and body size, and what does it mean to really accept people body sizes. And I think that's a really important kind of caveat to the conversation. Very often people who live in small bodies, we sort of ignore what they eat and assume they eat healthy, and then
Yeah,
people in large bodies, we assume that they're making decisions that are unhealthy, and there seems to be
it's
no
not always the
nuance
case.
in that
Yeah, it's not,
conversation.
frequently not the case, actually.
Yeah, no, quite frequently it's not the case. And that goes back to the fact that people's response to the foods are going to vary very differently. And then there are environmental factors, financial factors, access factors that also play a role in that conversation as well.
I would also add that culture is a really important factor, and not even just an individual's culture, but like for instance, the American culture. We no longer have a culture that everyone cooks dinner at home, and so
Yeah.
many people don't actually know how to cook.
Yeah.
And so that's a real limitation, right? You can't tell someone, okay, you have to go and you have to get all this food and you have to cook it when they don't even know where to start.
Right.
So there are a lot of culinary medicine programs that are cropping up across the country, which I'm really excited about because
Great.
that's a real barrier. They
Yeah.
need to figure out how to cook before they can actually take better care of themselves.
I completely agree with you. It's so funny, I think a lot of schools no longer have like home ec as part of,
Yes,
and I'm old enough to have had home ec when I was in elementary school. And it's funny though, I don't ever remember cooking anything that was healthy. Like I remember everything we made was like a baked good. I just like really remember, I remember like
that's a
making
good point.
cinnamon rolls and muffins, right? And so, to a certain extent, even the culinary education that we had in the US was very much based on comfort foods, frankly, right? And not so much on teaching us how to incorporate healthy eating into our cooking, which is why most adults don't know what kind of oil to use when they're cooking, or they're not really literate in terms of how to read a label and understand how it fits into their diet, or, anything beyond like cooking pasta starts to get complicated. And I think you pair that with a culture that is really interested in presentation, that's really, we really love our cooking shows. I think we start to set the bar a little too high,
It's true.
and it makes it not accessible for a lot of
Yeah,
people.
everyone doesn't need to have a Michelin star, right? We just need you just need to put something on the table that's gonna be palatable, which is
Right.
actually a pretty low bar.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
and some nights that's all you're gonna get, right? Like it's
Yeah.
only gonna be like, "Hey, that was palatable." But other nights you're gonna be like, "Well, I really enjoyed that."
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't need to be molecular gastronomy or any of these crazy things.
And just learning, like making mistakes, learning and figuring out what you like, experimenting with spices and flavorings and sauces, and
Yes.
starting to make some of your own, sauces at home to suit your palate and what you
I think
enjoy.
herbs and spices are also underutilized, in part
Couldn't
because
agree
people
more.
don't know how to use them. But you can add an insane amount of flavor to something with that,
Yeah.
and it's only adding nutrition and health benefits, right?
Yes.
You're not unlike salt, sugar, fat, all of those things, which
Right.
can actually at some point become detrimental. You
Yeah.
you, you can't really eat too much time. It's going to be very difficult to reach a dangerous level of eating too much time.
I don't even know that there is an upper limit on
I don't know either.
time.
Right?
Well, this is such an amazing conversation. Honestly, I can keep talking to you all day, but I think this is a great place for us to wrap up. I first of all wanted to say a big thank you for just this great conversation. It never fails. I always feel like we can get really granular and at the same time get really nuanced. And I so appreciate that about you. Thank you so much, Lee.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for everybody who attended.
Yes, thank you all for tuning in.